We welcome each of you to the Cable Center for this morning's event. Thank you for making the time to be with us. My name is Stan Swim. I'm the Chief Program Officer for the Bill of Rights Institute, a teacher training and curriculum organization that for 23 years has worked with teachers and students nationwide. 60,000 teachers at this point participate actively in our network, including some 1,300 teachers here in the state of Colorado. And through them, we serve over 130,000 students in your state each year. We express our thanks to the Daniels Fund for sponsoring this event in the Daniels Great Hall, I found out this morning. And thank the Fund's president, Hannah Scandera, from whom we will be hearing as part of today's program. We also recognize other staff from the Fund who are here in attendance, whose dedication to Bill Daniels' vision and continues to inspire and challenge all of us at the Institute. We also recognize Bonnie Kerrigan-Snyder from the Foundation for Individual Rights for Education and Steve Saltwick from Braver Angels, who will also be participating as part of today's discussion. I also want to thank the team who helped put this event together, and we'll invite them to stand as I call their names out. Kevin Hart, BRI's Communications Director, here in the back. Emily Trapani, who has handled event logistics. Jill Cullis, who has done terrific work for us here on the ground. As well as Anthony Simone and Rachel Waldowski from Bill of Rights Institute's development team. And finally, this doesn't work very well when the mics and the cameras and the lights don't work, and so I want to recognize those who are helping with our technical support for today. So thank you to Ron and all of his crew. But the real reason all of us have done all of this is to be here with each of you for today's conversation. We're joined today by elected officials and candidates with responsibility for education here in Colorado, as well as from my home state of Utah, just across the other side of the Rockies. We thank those officials and each of you for prioritizing this event this morning. We know that you're busy, and we're grateful for your service to children, to families, and your communities. Again, we hope you'll continue to enjoy your breakfast, get seconds as you need. I think there's still plenty back there. I can smell it. Living in a free society means learning to live with difference, sometimes a lot of it, and learning to do so constructively. A brief survey of the news today suggests we're having a tough time with that right now. Our institutions are struggling. America's civic culture is under severe stress. And that's just what we feel as adults. What about our children? How do we prepare these young people to do better than we're doing right now? One critical part, only one, but it is critical, and that is civic education, the focus of our discussion today. Teaching civics is hard. Students have real questions as they become aware of the society around them. Teachers work through those questions. They don't know which ones of those are going to come through the front door, the classroom door each day. But how that work occurs is important, and it's hotly debated. And it's hotly debated in no small part because we're arguing over the sum and substance of our nation's founding. But a civic education can be built and must be built on principles of liberty and justice as timelessly expressed in the Declaration of Independence. When you do that, that kind of an education can help prepare students for the responsibility of freedom. It can prepare them to examine the events of yesterday and today and equip them with the understanding they need and the first experiences they need to become wiser participants in this turbulent but remarkable and unique experiment that is America. To help us get a clearer picture of where civic education really stands today, it's a pleasure to introduce our first conversation. But before introducing our speakers, I do want to introduce Slido, a web tool that we're going to use to gather your questions today so that we can share them with our panel and speaker participants. On your phone or mobile device, if you'll please go to the URL up on the screen and put in the code 1791, At BRI, everything teaches. So your trivia for today is that's the year that the Bill of Rights was ratified. Just got to get that in there. So once you put that in, you'll be in a simple little web page that will allow you to submit questions. And as others in the room submit questions, you'll be able to sort of upvote a question that you also want to see asked. And in that way, the people who are up here moderating the conversation will be able to get a sense of what's most interesting to you, and we can steer the conversation accordingly. We look forward to your questions. Our first two speakers bring decades of experience in teaching, political philosophy, and educational leadership. David Bobb has served as president of the Bill of Rights Institute for more than 8 years now, during which time the Institute's reach has expanded to over 1/3 of the nation's history, government, and civics teachers. He's taught courses in American politics and public policy in history and political science departments of Boston College and Hillsdale College. He was also the founding director of a national civic education program for high school teachers at Hillsdale College, as well as the Allen P. Kirby Jr. Center for Citizenship and Constitutional Studies in Washington, D.C. David is also an accomplished French horn player, and that's relevant here. Musically, the French horn sits between the strings and the brass, connecting and drawing from both camps, and those really are two separate camps. Just ask the strings. David brings that same bent toward harmony to his work and to conversation like these. Please join me in welcoming David Bobb to the stand. Hannah Scandera is the Chief Executive Officer of the Daniels Fund, which carries forward Bill Daniels' legacy of compassion, integrity, and impact, and especially connection. By providing grants to nonprofit organizations and college scholarships to deserving students in Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming. She has over 2 decades of executive leadership experience and a proven track record of impact in a variety of national and state-level private, public, and nonprofit organizations serving rural, suburban, and urban educational needs. She previously served as a Secretary of Education for the state of New Mexico under Governor Susana Martinez, overseeing a budget of $2.7 billion and a staff of over 300 employees. Her tenure as Secretary of Education resulted in the most significant gains for students in New Mexico's recent history. Please join me also in welcoming to the stage the President of the Daniels Fund, Hannah Scandera. David.
Thank you so much, Hannah, for joining us today. Thank you for the leadership that you've offered in civic education and philanthropy. The first thing that I'd like to ask you, and I'll just underscore what Stan just mentioned, we look forward to your audience questions. I'll integrate them into our conversation, both with Hannah and our other speakers. But maybe we could start, we're in the Daniels Great Hall. Who was Bill Daniels? What was his vision? And specifically, what did he see important, most important really, in developing young citizens?
First of all, it's great to be here. And I'm taking a point of privilege since you turned it over to me for a second and just say thank you for doing what you do. I believe that the important conversation we're going to have today, I hope it's important, doesn't happen with different people in different places. We heard so many people, whether you're in public service, leading a nonprofit, in our schools on the front lines. Without you, we don't have the tools we need to, and I'll say these words pretty dramatically, fight the fight we need to fight for our kids and the next generation in our country. So just want to acknowledge your work and your investment and say thank you. So Bill Daniels, I get excited. We are in the Cable Center, which Bill Daniels, this is kind of his heart and home. He was a cable pioneer. He was an entrepreneur. And he fundamentally believed that if you saw something and went after it, you could truly change the world, and he did. By providing cable to places in our country that otherwise would not have access to television and communication that we take for granted and are now back to our smartphones and everything else. Well, we've come a long way. And he really, in my book, started that long way with the beginning of cable television. But his vision he wanted to give back to the communities. And I was mentioned earlier, we give in 4 states because those 4 states meant something personal to him. And he made a commitment, and we have 8 funding areas, but I would sum them up this way. Made a commitment to help develop contributing citizens. That's why we give scholarships. That's why we support Bill of Rights Institute and other great organizations, because we fundamentally believe in investing, and he believed in investing in the next generation. We support and encourage the promotion of the free market. We encourage the upward mobility and the opportunity and the dignity of work, and that's through investments in homelessness. And so we have incredible opportunities to really move forward what Bill Daniels believed was great about our country. He was a patriot, he fought in 2 wars, and he wanted to give back to a country that made things possible for him. And a lot of that had to do with education. He was a big believer in education and what education could provide. I think part of our conversation today is we want to see that promise of education continue forward, and it is not an easy promise to deliver on right now.
It's certainly not, and the promise of education, as Stan mentioned, is tied very much in the American context to the promise of the Declaration of Independence. I'm so grateful for the support that the Daniels Fund has provided the Bill of Rights Institute and to civic education in general. By prioritizing it, it's given us the opportunity to work in these states and to support teachers and students in the hard work that they do every day. Hannah, you brought to your role as CEO of the Daniels Fund a lot of experience in education and education reform. There are significant barriers right now to achieving that promise. What did your tenure as Secretary of Education in New Mexico teach you about those barriers and how we might start to overcome them?
So I'm gonna say some pretty strong things, and it comes out of almost 20 years of investing in education. And I say them with a conviction that it's on all of us to see ways that we can bring education to our students in a different way than we have to date. And what I'll say is I believe our education system as we know it today is broken. And it's a broken system with a broken relationship with our parents and our families. And it doesn't mean that we should abandon it. It means we need to rethink, not just, especially in a time that we've been through, whether it's, you think about COVID, the cultural and political dynamics that we're in right now that are tough. We've had a health crisis, we've had an education crisis, and we have a culture crisis. And we could all sit and just go home now, because that's a little depressing to say, or we can say, and not to be cliche, what an opportunity. We have an opportunity today going forward to meet parents, families, this generation with something they desperately need, and to run back to what we've known and just recreate something, the system that we've known, I think is a missed opportunity. And investing in things like civics and in our Bill of Rights, there's so many different pieces that are going to matter as we go forward. But I'll give a couple data points that are really compelling about the moment and time we're in. They have to do with education. First of all, from a civics standpoint, we know that only 1 in 5 Americans, I should say 1 in 5 Americans cannot name our 3 branches of government. We know that 24% of 8th graders are on grade level when it comes to civics education. So we're at a time when actual basic knowledge is needed. Do I think knowledge solves the problem? I don't, actually. Let me add another set of data that I think if we put these 2 things together, the opportunity is just profound. Because of what happened during COVID, I think parents and families had an opportunity to see what kind of education their kids were receiving. And for some, it was tremendous. For others, it was not. And if you look at the data over the last year, we've had over 1 million children leave our traditional public education system. We've had over 200,000 choose charter schools as an option. So our enrollment in charter schools is up 7%. That's a choice, public school choice that parents are making. Homeschooling numbers have doubled. And homeschooling numbers for Black families have gone up 5 times in a single year. This tells me something. It tells me parents are looking for a way forward for their kids, and they want to be a part of the solution. So as we think about civic education and the public education crisis we're seeing today, we ought to be asking ourselves, how do we think about solutions that bring opportunities for parents and families? And I will say this, the Daniels Fund has a goal of 100,000 new choice seats, public, private, alternative, you name it, by 2030, because we believe this is a moment in time. And we also have a goal of 1 million children by 2030 having a good civic education opportunity. And we believe that the Civics B that we've started in partnership with the U.S. Chamber and other partnerships like we have with you are opportunities to reach kids with basic knowledge that if we want change agents in the next generation, I don't think knowledge solves it, I think it's the foundation, and we've got to start there.
Those are wonderful goals. Just to clarify, is the 100,000 new seats within the Daniels Fund priority for states?
It is. So it's an aggressive goal. We're going to need partners. So we're talking to a lot of folks and saying, join us. And how do we create options for parents and families that desperately want them? And I was thinking, and by the way, I live in Denver. I love this city. And as I said, I invested 20 years in public education. Please know this is complex. It is hard. Our teachers have been through more than any other generation of teachers that I can think of. And so it's a hard time. But I also am going to land with, in the Denver public school system, 5% of our Hispanic and Black children are on grade level right now. 5%. That is a crisis. That is a generation. And we've got to find a way to reach them.
You know, you have talked about a broken system, and I completely agree that so much of what we're seeing right now and what parents are getting an even closer look at because of what happened. The classroom was brought into their living rooms, into their kitchens. When you think about our topic for today, which is the reconsideration, the reimagination of what we need, what are the critical factors? You know, if you're building towards those 100,000 new seats, you're building towards 1 million kids that are getting a solid civic education. What are the factors that are going to rebuild trust between parents and educators, and I guess I'd throw in administrators as well?
Yep. Such a great question. And I do fundamentally believe it is about rebuilding a relationship. We can talk about the system, and we could talk for a long time about what works, what doesn't, from a systems and policy perspective, and there's a lot of things that we could say. But as a starting point, the data I shared about parents and choice, I shared it because it tells me that parents are looking to be met in their desire for their kids. And so as I think about the opportunities, this is a time to reach parents with choices and opportunities and equip them. Yeah. And I'll just say, we see the Civics B, you think, oh, it's Civics B, that's kind of sweet. It is sweet, actually. If you saw some of the clips, you would just be like, these sixth graders, it's just incredible. And it's just, heartwarming, exciting. I'm going to say it, it just was like, and this is why I love being an American, because you're seeing these kids but I want to say something. I believe it's bigger than a heartwarming moment. I fundamentally believe it is about equipping our kids with the knowledge to truly be engaged in a way that's meaningful. Knowledge doesn't do it all. But so as we think about how do we think about building these bridges, and I do think it starts with a relationship that it brings, and so the Civics B, for example, brings parents and families and organizations and kids together in a very simple way to be engaged and to be a part of a solution. And I do think that's a starting point. I think that's what you do. As your teachers are in the classrooms and your training teachers in the classrooms, it is part of building a solution and equipping young people and educators with real information they need to truly be a part of solutions, not just today, but for generations to come.
I'm so glad that you mentioned the Civics B. I've had the pleasure of serving on the advisory board for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation that's running that, and it's in the pilot stage. And it is inspirational to see young people have those light bulb moments. You are committed at the Daniels Fund as a philanthropist now to doing civics in a nonpartisan way. The headwinds against that effort are considerable. Because what we've seen, the Daniels Fund is a little over 20 years old, the Bill of Rights Institute is just over 20 years old. I think it's safe to say in the last couple of decades, we've seen a polarization in the civics and history education realm that has mirrored that of the nation, such that what often happens is people want their own version of history, their own version of civics that aligns with kind of where they're at in a partisan way. What do you do to meet those headwinds and meet that challenge head on and ensure that what you're doing is actually nonpartisan work?
Yeah. I don't mean to be Pollyanna, but we have to chuckle for just a brief moment that we have to ask this question. Yeah. But we do. So, because we are in a time where what I think, even as I look back, what used to be what I would consider just American. Hey, it's just an American thing. It now feels like there's sides that we're choosing. And I recently had a conversation where I was talking with a friend, and we had a very different view on a civic dynamic, and said, everything in our culture right now is pushing us to choose a side. Mm-hmm. And what if we actually stood as Americans first? And that sounds Pollyanna, but it is a choice, and I do believe that. It doesn't solve this. Mm-hmm. It doesn't make it go away, but it is first a choice to say, all right, can we find that place? And my personal, if you look at the data, the vast majority of Americans are looking for that. Mm-hmm. They don't want to sit in a polarized, crazy environment that's just everything you say explodes. Mm-hmm. They want to stand in a space where they can be a contributing citizen. So I think as we think about this, calling people and giving them opportunities, calling them back to or towards what I believe, and like I said, the data supports this, the most Americans truly are looking for. So first, providing that calling, and then provide opportunities. The Civics B, like I said, it sounds sweet, and it is sweet. It is an incredibly intentional effort to say, there are opportunities, whether you are a mom or a dad or a grandma or the leader of a nonprofit, to bring your sixth grader to a space where they can learn more and participate in something in their community. And that sounds, kind of simple, but it's the simple things matter. And so let's call ourselves and our fellow folks across our country to something that they can be a part of, and then provide opportunities to be a part of it. I mean, that is what you're doing at the Bill of Rights Institute. You're calling something out and then saying, come join us. And it is not enough. I love that we get to have this conversation, but let's just be clear. We all go home. And whatever seat we sit in or place we stand in, we have a choice every day to say, am I calling and going to something? And am I doing something small, big, somewhere in between that is actually towards what we fundamentally believe and provides an opportunities for young people in particular? That is, I do have a deep conviction that about this generation and the generations to come. So when I think about, it's simple. Let's call out what we know to be true. There are things maybe we don't know. There are things we know. And provide opportunities for others to stand and be a part in very simple ways that will make a difference.
One of the stirring things about Bill Daniels' example is that he was a man of action. And I think what you're pointing us to, Hannah, is that there is an important knowledge component to this. The Civics B gets that. We hope to do that at the work of with the work of the Bill of Rights Institute. But another important part of this, we've talked a little bit about polarization. If you talk to a teenager, they're not going to cite you the latest public opinion surveys, right, about negative polarization. But what they start to worry about in ways that they probably don't even know is, can I be with my friends and talk about something substantive and disagree with them and not lose that friendship? Yeah. Now, you've pointed us and I think given us a really clear call to not just rethinking, reimagining this, but actually acting. You do that in 4 states. These states are red, blue, and purple. This is a really hard challenge. What have you seen to work? And I guess I'll ask, can we actually get to that same sort of being an American, despite the fact that we're in states now, that you're operating in states where there is that really kind of extraordinary grooving in, where you say, we're in kind of our political lane and we don't want to move. Because kids don't feel that, right? They don't wake up and, as a 15-year-old, start and say, boy, I'm going to be a blue person now, you know? They're just trying to figure out what does red, blue, and purple mean.
Well said.
But what are the kind of strategies that you see for combating some of those negative effects of polarization?
Yeah, I feel like I'm going to sound like I'm beating a dead horse, but I will say this, and you're right that the states we invest in, they are different, have different political leanings, et cetera, and I love that because that is part of what is being American, right? And when I think about our Civics B, our pilot this year, we were in Maryland, Kentucky, New Mexico, Texas, and Iowa. All very different places. And you wouldn't believe the celebration that took place at these Civics Bs. I'm not kidding. I mean, we had secretaries of states participate and grandparents bringing their kids, right? I mean, and I think there's something really powerful when we think about opportunities. I've done a lot of systems change work in a different life. And you could say many people believe that's kind of a top-down approach. I think the opportunity that's presenting to us today is to really move the needle. We have to have a grassroots, local, people owning every day what's possible, Civics B at the local level, with an opportunity across the country, more of a brass tops look. So when we see those two things come together, and that's not about red, blue, or purple, or any other color. It's just about, hey, what can we get done together in a way that's meaningful? And that you're not making it about what color you are. You're making it about the opportunity to come together. And that sounds, like I said, super Pollyanna. You know this, we've talked about this. I mean, as the Secretary of Education, it took me 4 years to be Senate confirmed because they did not run out of time. There was healthy debate. And I say that to say, I'm not trying to be Pollyanna, but I do think we have to kind of go back to the basics and dig in on the ground and be a part of change. And that, like I said, that all those things can sound really cliche or they can mean something. And the reason we invested and partnered and are so excited about something like the Civics B, something like the Bill of Rights Institute, something like Choice for Parents, is because it gives the opportunity for ownership by each individual or family or community to actually be a part of something to move forward versus just, here's a program and hands off. And I do think that it is a time where we have to be willing to invest in the small and in the big things, but starting with the small.
It's usually between 70 and 80% of Americans still agree with the idea that education should be a local thing. We're here today to consider the idea that there may very well be the need for a new social compact, by which we mean something very simple, that having seen our system as a broken one, we need to rethink at every level of governance, local, state, even the national arrangements, the structures that you just pointed to, Hannah, a new way of thinking about responsibilities. Could you reflect a little bit on the role of public policy? We've talked about philanthropy. What are some of the major things that you would encourage public policy makers, a world that you know so well, we have some here in the audience, to think about when they're reimagining the brokenness of our system and how to get back on the right track?
Yeah. So I don't think there's a magic bullet, full stop, just want to name that. There's not this moment that if we all did X right away, it would all would be right in the world, so to speak. This is a complex. I chuckled as you were forming that question because I was thinking, you were able to say, this is a local, it's a state, it's a federal, it's all these, that is basic civic education. So I just want to, when you know that, you can start thinking about how to, start solving problems, right? And so, but as I think about this, I will go back to, and like I said, I love education, I'm a believer in it. Bill Daniels believed it was game-changing and the opportunity for upward mobility in our country, and it has been for so many. we are, right now, you've seen the data, I'm sure, that this generation is the first generation, actually they're about 20 years old now, that are not better off than their parents. First time in our history. Something isn't working the way we hope it would for too many. It's working for some, but not enough. And so as I think about systemic change, you do have to name when something's not working and own it. And that doesn't mean you've lost faith. It doesn't mean you don't believe something great is possible. So as I say, I think our public education system is broken. It does not mean I think we should just abandon everything, all those things. But it is a time, if you have a broken system, I also will put with it, we have broken relationships, whether that's with our teachers, our parents, our families, and to begin to restore those relationships and give opportunity and empower our parents, et cetera, I believe is a big starting point. I also think Bill Daniels was an entrepreneur. And I'll just name this because this is my first foray, and there's great joy and pride in getting to be the CEO of the Daniels Fund. It's my first time in philanthropy. And let me just say this. Philanthropy on the whole is not known for being agile, entrepreneurial, responsive. We're chuckling because we actually know that's true. And what a grief. To me, so from a philanthropic standpoint, what's the opportunity? The opportunity in this moment is to be agile, to be entrepreneurial. We need entrepreneurial ideas right now. One of them is going to work, 5 of them are going to work, 20 will fail. That is what entrepreneurialism is. But at the end of the day, when it comes to education, rebuilding systems, creating opportunities, those do not happen in static environments. Those opportunities do not emerge if we all sit and just hope it fixes. They emerge when we engage and actually create new opportunities, new pathways, new ways to do things. And I do believe, both in K-12 and in higher ed, and we actually have launched an entrepreneurial fund at the Daniels Fund called the Vela Fund because, and is modeled after a larger fund that Stand Together has put together. We've done it for our 4 states. And we did it because we said we need new ideas. And we know, full stop, some of them will not work, but some will. And our kids, generations, our country deserves these new ideas, these new opportunities to reimagine what's possible in our education system today.
Hannah, some are going to hear what you say, and their response might be something like this. Look, you're dealing with children here. You can't experiment. The stakes are too high. We need to think about those pathways that are going to be more sure and not experimental. What would you say to those kind of responses?
In all seriousness, I was smiling just for a minute because sometimes I have this moment, and I'm going to sound like I don't believe in education, and I do. But I just want to say one thing. When 5% of your children are on grade level, it is not working. That is a horrific experiment for a generation. And that is not to make Denver Public Schools feel bad. We're seeing this across the country right now. So to say, we can't afford, I'm not saying to experiment with our children. That is an experiment. 5% success rate is not okay. So at the end of the day, I would say, yes, we need to be thoughtful. Yes, there's a responsibility with the freedoms of entrepreneurialism that needs to be carried, for sure. And in the same breath, I'd say, we do not have the luxury of not thinking about other options and opportunities.
You've mentioned the National Civics B, and one of the things that I have been so impressed with that in its early stages is that it's seeking to give young people voice and agency. We started by talking about the importance of knowing. There's also an importance of doing. Could you tell us just a little bit about how that is built into the structure of the Civics B and why it's so important that young people are given an opportunity to succeed?
So I love, obviously, I love the Civics B for so many reasons. I keep talking about it. But let me just say this. I emphasize the knowledge piece because I think that's so important that our young people actually know how you get a law passed. Is the Supreme Court elected or appointed? Based on, I don't know if any of you saw that Wall Street Journal article recently that said, I'm not sure we understand that the Supreme Court is actually appointed, not elected based on the protests outside of our Supreme Court justices' homes. But I say, so knowledge I think is super important, and I do think that's a part of the Civics B. But there's a whole piece in the Civics B where kids actually present a problem in their community through an essay first that they want to solve. So there's an opportunity to actually, and I'll use education buzzwords, critically think and apply your knowledge. It's not enough just to know it. It's a baseline, it's a foundation. But so what does this mean for you when you live in Albuquerque, New Mexico? What do you want to change? And what do you want to be a part of? And how are you going to do it? So in this journey, in this Civics B, these young people are writing an essay about a problem they see that they want to solve. And they're using their civics knowledge to talk about how they would create a solution. So it is knowledge-based, but as we all know, we could all sit in our chair and hope, I'm not going to offend anybody with a PhD. I've gotten a graduate degree. I'm a believer in education, like I said. But the goal is not to be piled higher and deeper in some steeped in knowledge. Mm-hmm. The goal is to know something to actually make it real in some way, shape, or form. And so I just say that to say that we're trying to see that happen as we see this Civics B get off the ground, and so that it is knowledge. But then, okay, what are you going to do with that knowledge? What does that look like? So we're excited about it.
In research that was made possible by the support of the Daniels Fund and conducted by the Bill of Rights Institute partner in the state of Utah, the Sutherland Institute, parents overwhelmingly pointed to critical thinking as the #1 goal that they wanted for civic education. So the important thing to remember, I think, when you think about critical thinking is that you have to have something about which to think critically. And so that points to the combination of the knowledge and the active component. The last thing that I'd like to ask you, and this echoes a question posed from the audience, as the Daniels Fund enters the third decade of your operations, what defines success in civics for you? And what will ultimately define it for our nation?
Whoever asked that question, holy smokes. I would just say, first, I don't know that I can answer that like when I think about our nation writ large, but I'll give you what we're hopeful for and what we are humbled that we hope to be a part of, and that is this opportunity to partner with so many, yes, in our 4 states, but our dream is that we're partnering with folks all across the country so that there is, like I said, a grassroots desire to see our kids equipped and empowered in a way. And, I said our goal is 1 million young people by 2030, but let's be clear, that's not enough. And we think that's bold for us, but it's not enough. And so as I think and look ahead, I believe Bill Daniels had a vision that was beyond his generation. And that's why he invests in education. That's why we have a foundation. And so the big answer to me is a generational one. It's way beyond our lifetimes. But it starts now, today, with the investments we make and the opportunities we have. And success looks for us like investing in the communities that Bill Daniels believed in and had his heart in, because he either lived there, started a business there, owned a sports team there, whatever it may be, that we're investing in ways that aren't just for a moment in time, but they have a lasting impact that builds something beyond your and my lifetime, beyond his lifetime, and ignite a fire across our country for what is possible for generations to come, for this great country that we get to live in.
Thank you so much, Hannah. This is a wonderful framing for our conversation today. Thank you for all of the work that you're leading.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's great.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, Hannah. I'll just remind everybody, if you aren't already submitting questions, we are getting some on the Slido app, so if you want to go out there, not only can you put your own questions in, but if somebody asks the one you wish you would have asked, you can upvote that question, and that tells us more than one person has it. The second part of our program today is going to consider the very practical things of a relationship between parents, teachers, and communities, and how we chart a productive path forward. That's not an easy topic, and it's one that has roiled local schools and local school board elections, as you know very well right here. The stakes would be high if it were only our nation writ large. But we're also talking about children and a rising generation, and that makes it even more critical and complicated. In the time left today, we can only start to unpack that. But we do want to go straight to the tough questions and to your tough questions. And our two guests bring ideal backgrounds for that task. Bonnie Kerrigan-Snyder brings 20 plus years of experience in a variety of roles and institutions, including teacher, counselor, administrator, and professor in both public and private schools. An honors graduate of Harvard with a master's degree in counseling from Virginia Tech and a doctorate in higher education from Penn State. She's the author of The New College Reality, The Unemployed College Graduate's Survival Guide, and co-author of Finding Your Voice, a free speech comic. Her latest book is Undoctor How Politicized Classrooms Harm Kids and Ruin Schools, and What We Can Do About It. Bonnie now serves as High School Outreach Fellow at the Foundation for Individual Rights on Education. Bonnie, please join us on the podium. Steve Saltwick is a biopsychologist by training. That sounds like an interesting profession to figure out on its own, Steve. And his career in the tech industry took him on a path through 6 continents. He has served as a board member for companies including Partner One Capital and Modius. As a part of the Braver Angels National Leadership Team, Steve works with the organization to decrease political polarization, including around key education issues. He now serves as the co-director for field operations at Braver Angels, which has chapters all over the country, and he works to grow local and state chapters wherever they are. Please join me likewise in welcoming Steve to the platform.
Thank you both for joining us. We're looking forward to a vigorous conversation. We already have questions streaming in, so I'll try to get to as many of them as possible. We want to dive right in, and Bonnie, I'm going to start with you, please. Can you just tell us a little bit about your background? You've worn a lot of different hats in the educational arena, and also what is the mission and work of the organization that you're with now, FIRE?
Yeah, thanks. I'll be glad to. I think that I came to this role and this work because of being at the forefront of the collapse of education in the humanities, which is where many of these troubling ideologies seem to from where they seem to derive. I was an English major as an undergraduate. I was a high school English teacher and a high school counselor. And I always thought that I would become a college professor of English literature. And I found myself at a school I won't name, where I was inundated with what was then called literary theory. Mm-hmm. And so I had a very early introduction to it. I did not take kindly to it. It did not suit me. And I was quick to recognize. Interestingly, also, I sort of minored at Harvard in Russian, learning about the Soviet Union and so on, because that was the peak of the Cold War. And so I sort of recognized the one book I was assigned as an undergraduate I was only assigned one book more than once at Harvard, and that was the Communist Manifesto. It was assigned to me 6 separate times. So. Yeah, so that made an impression in a number of different ways, and so I was quick to pick up on the Marxist elements of literary theory, which could also have, at that time, have been called critical feminist theory. And even though I'm a woman, I was not amenable to critical feminist theory as well, which basically consisted of looking at a book, deciding whether it was written by a man or a woman, and rejecting it on those grounds rather than considering it on the universal, the universal themes that could apply to anyone. So I dropped out of my dream career, which was English professor, and it was probably one of the smartest decisions I've ever made, given the collapse of the humanities in the universities. So that's sort of, I guess, the long and short answer there. I've had a unique, I think, perspective on the ideology that is driving many of the problems that we're seeing. If at FIRE, which is the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, we defend and sustain the individual liberty, the individual rights of students and faculty on college campuses. And those rights include freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of religion, legal equality, and freedom of conscience, the sanctity to your own thoughts and to have them and to uphold them and to believe them and to say what you actually think. So when I'm at conferences talking to people, the short answer to what does FIRE do, I like to say we defend your right to disagree, to say I don't think so.
Wonderful. That's certainly worth applauding. And Rose Martinez asks a question. I'll put a pin in it and we'll come back to it later, but it's a great question because we worry or see right now a lessening of the prestige associated with the teaching profession. Rose's question is, how can we restore that? So let's come back to that later in the conversation.
Yeah.
Steve, I want to turn to you and ask, same question, what's also a biopsychologist, and what does Braver Angels do?
Okay. Well, let me answer the second one first. Braver Angels is a national nonprofit targeted at bringing Americans together, bridging a partisan divide, and strengthening our democracy in terms of public policy. Now, what's unique about Braver Angels is we're a grassroots organization. So we have members and chapters in all the states. There are several people here today from the local Denver Alliance. And typically our focus up until date has been citizen-to-citizen interaction. We're expanding that, I know there's some elected officials here, to go citizen-to-government official or elected official. Because again, we think the time merits that kind of an approach. And we can offer proof that we'll talk about today. Now, what's a biopsychologist, right? A biopsychologist is someone that uses information about how the brain is wired to understand and guide behavior. That's kind of the textbook definition. What I can tell you is it was a fast path to unemployment in 1970 at the University of Texas. So I thought it was great, but I couldn't get a job. So I went into high tech, if you could call it high tech, in the 1970s, and I wound up traveling the world. And that traveling is what brought me to Braver Angels, because that travel made me realize two things. One, that living in America was to be treasured. And then the second thing was that life is at risk. It's at risk with polarization, right? And I wanted to do something about that. That brought me to Braver Angels. I get to use my knowledge of brain wiring as we try to help our 10,000 members and 50,000 subscribers bridge partisan divides and make progress in this field.
That's great. Having lived for now about 15 years in our nation's capital, I'm intrigued by the work that you're doing with members of Congress. We may or may not have time to get to that, but Bonnie, I want to ask you about your recent book. Undoctor Nation is a really useful book because not only does it look at the problems endemic with ideological kind of framing within classrooms, it offers a pathway to redress those problems that are in our schools. We have a question from Joanne Kadori. Are there any tactful methods for addressing divisive topics such as critical race theory? What I want to ask you about in a related way is, can you just give us the basic thesis of indoctrination, your book, and why, or really what is the problem of teachers imposing their ideology in the classroom? Why is that so problematic in your mind?
Sure. Well, the reason it's problematic is because children are impressionable. They are suggestible. Teachers, I find it so ironic that most of the ideologies that are causing problems right now, the main ideology seems to be focused on identifying power and oppression dynamics within systems. And that is one lens and one lens only. I happen to think that it's a rather esoteric graduate level lens, and I find it kind of inappropriate that it's being imported to students who are still at the introductory level. So I just consider it to be personally poor pedagogy, poor praxis. That being said, I wouldn't, we're a free speech organization, FIRE. I'm not opposed to students hearing different points of view, but this ideology seeks to silence opposing points of view, and I do have a problem with that. I wonder as well how many teachers who are, and it's being used as the only lens with which to look at everything. And to me, criticism, it has its place, but to feed young people a diet of nothing but criticism is extremely unwholesome, unnutrifying. To me, criticism is like salt on a steak. You might sprinkle a little bit and it might make it taste better, but you don't hand someone a plate full of salt and say, enjoy your meal.
What are some of the tactful ways then, if you think of this problem, and you've talked about the critical feminist theory that you encountered in college. We see critical race theory today. What are some of the ways that you urge in your book to, as our questioner asked, tactfully address this problem?
I think there are teachers who are engaged in, well, you have different varieties of teachers. And I don't know how many people have ever read Eric Hoffer's The True Believer. Some are true believers.
Yeah.
True believers need to be held accountable by the administrators, by the state, by the bureaucracy. There are means that are being implemented. There are checks and balances that are operating right now to hold those teachers accountable. So that is, I believe, a minority of teachers. I think you have to determine which type of actor you're talking about. I think some teachers have not been properly educated themselves at this point, and I have sympathy for that. And so I think you have to ask yourself, as you do probably in every interaction you have in your life, am I dealing with a person who's acting in good faith with me, or am I not? I think if the person is in good faith, then you can open a conversation, and I would probably start by asking, do you realize that what you are teaching is critical pedagogy? And what do you understand it? And do you understand what other perspectives exist? Because I believe some of these teachers truly do not know what other ways there are of looking at things because of the impoverishment of their own educations. And for them, I have pity, I have compassion, and I think that they can improve. And I think that this situation can be rectified by enriching their own education, probably through professional development. They're getting a steady diet of nothing but this, I don't want to exaggerate, of nearly nothing, of little else than what is being called DEI training. And a lot of that is very ideologically laden. And so they don't know any differently, and you can't blame people for not knowing what they haven't yet been taught. And that's where I think I would start.
We see that fascinating dynamic play out a lot in the work that the Bill of Rights Institute does. When we gather teachers together, often 30, 40, 50 at a time, in professional learning programs, there's often a dialogue about how much you should let your own convictions loose in the classroom. Some people would say, show your students what it's like to have beliefs and to stick to them. Others would say you ought to be neutral, or at least not make the classroom your own kind of personal platform. But where we find, and where I'd agree with you completely, Bonnie, is that most teachers are still interested in representing diverse viewpoints, but few have been given the formal training by which that can happen. That's one of the reasons that the Bill of Rights Institute exists. Recently, Johns Hopkins University did a survey of 11 different curricula, from mainstream textbooks in civics to the 1619 curriculum to iCivics, and they included our materials in civics as well. We scored very high in that rating, and when it came time to judge the Pulitzer Center's curriculum put together for the New York Times 1619 project, the Johns Hopkins University Institute that ran this study said, we cannot assign a numerical score. Why? Because it's not a curriculum. A curriculum must have more than one lens. And I think that's something that comes out so clearly in your book, and why I would commend it to everybody's attention. That what Bonnie is criticizing is not viewpoint diversity, but rather, on the contrary, forcing students, taking the honor and privilege and responsibility that is given to an educator by local communities, by parents, that entrusting being betrayed to a misunderstanding in which the teacher takes it upon himself or herself to make the students toe an ideological line. That's the thing that we're concerned about, and that is part of the brokenness today. There's other parts. Steve, I want to turn to you, and if you can address, we've heard about polarization some in the conversation. Hannah Scandera mentioned it as a problem. Braver Angels has identified it as one of the major challenges of today. Could you just tell us what it is, simple terms, and then also what you're doing to really redress that problem?
Sure. There's a range of polarizations, and some polarizations is natural in a democratic society. I mean, we can be polarized on our opinion of whether we should do this act or that act, right? I mean, that's a difference of opinion. At Braver Angels, what we're really concerned about is called affective polarization. Now, this means we don't just disagree on whether we should do A or B. It means we hold the other side in contempt. In fact, oftentimes we hold the other side as an enemy that must be vanquished at any cost. And this is not healthy. So you can look at studies of the market. I mean, now Pew Research is saying basically in both major political parties, and that is really the bulk of our focus today, 90% of a member of a major political party has an unfavorable view of the other party. In fact, within those parties, if you talk to adults with children, members of a political party, over half the members of a political party would be upset if their child married a member of the other party. This is not healthy. And what we find is so often this is based upon stereotypes of what one person within a political party or a group has about the members of the other side. And so addressing those stereotypes, David, really is, that's the technique we focus on, is getting beyond stereotypes in interacting as humans. And that's what Braver Angels is focused on.
We have a great question that I think is a good follow-on here. This is from William Robinson, and I'll just read it out loud. Steve, this is for you. Bonnie, if you have thoughts on this is open to you as well. Using entrepreneurial thinking, how would we teach critical thinking skills in civics to recognize and reject the underpinnings of conspiracy thinking? Do you run into that at all in your work at Braver Angels?
Yeah, and let me give you kind of like a thumbnail of that, right? Because there's probably three things that I would bring to this equation, right? And we call it the Braver Angel way, and it's got three parts, right? I mean, and the first part is basically to have hope that progress can be made. Because so much of the media and so much of the stuff you hear and watch on the news and all that is that this is hopeless, and it's not. I can guarantee you, I've seen with my own eyes 100 times very diverse groups come to understand common value, right? The question is the method. You need a method so that one side listens to understand the perspective of the other side. You don't have to agree to it. You need to understand it sufficiently to be able to state it back to the other side, and that side goes, you got it. We also encourage self-reflection, so it's not just what does the other side think, it's like how might my side be contributing to this problem? And what we find is once you kind of break that stereotype, now naturally cooperation and common values emerge, right? And if the biopsychologist in me can jump in for just a minute here. The ability to understand the perspective of another side is a unique capability of the human brain. No other animal on this planet can do that. I know that sounds weird. It's not like empathy. Empathy really is feeling someone else's pain. Lots of animals can do that. But to truly appreciate a perspective of the other side is human unique. One might argue it is a skill not being displayed very often in the current environment, but I assure you it can be done with the right method, and it's a simple method. You break beyond those stereotypes, you understand a perspective of the other side, common values emerge, and I would say in this educational environment, I would not be surprised, in fact, I would assume that the common value that would unite parents, educators, administrators, political figures, et cetera, would be exactly that, critical thinking skills. So the ability to distrust stereotypes, search multiple sources of information, right? Separate fact from opinion, actively investigate information, right? We are capable of that, right? And we got to get out of calling one side versus the other. It's understanding a common value and work from there. That's what I would suggest.
Let's get to brass tacks. When we look at the brokenness of our system, one of the challenges that teachers face, and we see this at the Bill of Rights Institute, where 47% of our teachers tell us that they feel very much, they believe that parents of the children in their classroom do not want those teachers to talk about current events or anything controversial. Bonnie, you've been in the classroom, you've taught at the university level. You know that delicate balance of trust that exists between parents and teachers. We also know that administrators oftentimes stand in the way of divisive issues being discussed in a proper way even. Because what the signal that they send in subtle and not so subtle ways is, we don't want any melees, let's not really talk about such and such an issue. Let's not go down that path to talk about some of the hard things in our history. Let's just stick to the more anodyne stuff. So teachers face this kind of pressure where they want to do, many of them, the right thing. They want to talk about deep subjects and do it in a way that honors the conversation. What are the ways that we can start to renegotiate the terms on which they're able to do that? What are some of the practical steps we can take for parents and administrators to get them in a better place?
Controversial topics in schools can create classroom management problems. Teachers probably, in the room know this. Adolescents have trouble controlling their emotions. So you want to, step by step, build capacity to be able to address these issues rationally and logically without tripping into triggering. Adolescents have what's known as a two-track mind. They can be inductive, they can be deductive, they can be emotional, or they can be rational. So can adults, incidentally. Adolescents, though, need more practice at it. So, at FIRE, we put together a 5-level system of how to build capacity to have difficult conversations, and we sort of have different topics where you can rank them. And a simple way to start would be, Coke versus Pepsi. Who really cares? But people might have some strong opinions on it, but nobody's probably going to get emotional. And then we sort of give different topics hot pepper ratings. There are some issues that certain people will not be able to discuss rationally at a certain time in a certain place. I would not recommend going to Texas or anywhere in the country right now to try to discuss with young people school shootings or the Second Amendment right now. It's not the time, it's not the place. You're not going to have a productive, rational discussion. A few years ago, I would have said you probably would not be able to have a productive discussion about immigration and the border wall. I think you probably could now. So that's where the professional discretion of the teacher comes in. And it is there. I do a talk when I go to different conferences called Bans, Boundaries, and Balance. And, I give teachers 4 guidelines on questions to ask yourself before you bring up a topic. And one of them is it inflammatory? And because teachers have been fired over this. Inflammatory basically means that it disrupts the class and prevents you from achieving the learning objectives of the day. So that could be like a local crime, talking about a local crime, and you might have children in the classroom who are connected to that crime. That's just a poor choice. So, in current events are tricky. And this might sound discouraging, and I'm not saying you should never do it, but it can go wrong depending on it can work first period, and it can go very badly fifth period depending on who's in that classroom. But my current joke on this is hindsight is 20/20, right? That's a saying we've all heard. Well, if hindsight is 20/20, which means clear and focused, what does that say about present sight? It's probably pretty blurry, right? It's probably pretty unclear. So I personally don't think that the best learning opportunities always come from current events. I don't think that it gives students, particularly under 18, the perspective that they might need to be able to look at something rationally. So I would use that sort of as spice. I wouldn't use it as a daily diet myself. I would be very careful with it.
Yeah, I think that's where a lot of teachers, we send out to the inbox of tens of thousands something called an e-lesson, which is that kind of serving of spice that can jumpstart a conversation. So you enter into a historic or a foundational civics question through a current events framing, just so that they can have a little bit of context. But I think your cautionary note about how quickly it can go off the rails is one that we see a lot.
You have to be skillful, you have to have practice. Teachers don't get enough training in it. And I would also say that this is one of the methods that's being used to bypass critical thinking and reach the emotional sectors of young people in order to promote certain ideologies. And I've actually seen trainings on this, and they call it teaching on days after. And this is a way in which the activism mindset is emboldened. And so I find it to be not the best pedagogy and sometimes used for purposes I don't support.
Steve, you've thought a lot about the way that we're even configuring meetings to discuss some of these issues. The classic American school board meeting in which people stand and deliver, and sometimes we'll have a timed 3 minutes in which to deliver their statement, has presented a fora for a lot of participation. But could you just comment a little bit, using that Braver Angels methodology, on ways in which we might think about improving the means by which we disagree and the means by which we get to a better place?
Yeah, David, I mean, I think we would call many of the forums that are established, have a long history, and they're kind of like 19th century designs. And I don't think that they're best suited for the kind of online, streaming, media-hungry, polarized environment we are today. Because at Braver Angels, what we're really trying to do is get all sides together, right? Just get beyond stereotypes, begin to appreciate the perspectives of the other side, and that is not going to be done in a traditional school board meeting. Right? Great media, but it's not good progress against stereotypes. So what we generally encourage is for people to get together with a few simple ground rules, and then there's a very simple method. It's based on family therapy technique, where you listen to understand, you acknowledge, and then there's something called a pivot, which is very important. You ask permission from the other side to share your perspective. So by listening and acknowledging, the other person or the other people within the environment go, wait a minute, you actually listen to me and you can understand where I'm coming from? And we emphasize lived experience in this. So if someone comes to a position on an issue, well, how did they get there? And this is not the objective truth of it, or what is truth and what is false. How did you come to that perspective on this issue? And when we share that, and this has been done even in Congress, the co-founder of Braver Angel, Bill Doherty, is doing workshops in members of Congress, local state legislators, and all of that. And when they share their life experiences of how they got to perspectives on this, there's huge learning that goes forward here, right? Then the pivot, asking permission, basically then the other side grants you permission for you to give your observations on something like this. It's a very powerful technique. I mean, we call it the LAPP, L-A-P-P, listen, acknowledge, pivot, perspective. Simple to do, hard to do, right? It's hard work. But I have seen this work, including high school classrooms, on sensitive topics. I think Bonnie's warnings on current events is well placed and all that. But very divisive topics I've seen with my own eyes at the level of high school students and above, be effectively addressed with this kind of simple technique.
If your methodology can get members of Congress to listen, that would be revolutionary.
Remember, we're going bottom up here first, okay?
In my experience,
Washington will change when there's no other choice, okay, right?
In my experience, it's much easier to teach civics to fifth graders than to members of Congress. There's an interesting question here that I think follows right in line with what you both have been saying. Stephanie Wheeler asks, what about the role of actually teaching emotional intelligence? Is that something that you think can be taught or should be taught in classrooms? Bonnie, let's start with you and then Steve.
By a qualified instructor, yes. I'm very concerned about teachers going outside the boundaries of their licensure. Teachers are licensed because, you know, the same way that dentists are licensed and even cosmetologists are licensed, because you're in a position to do harm. And I think we have a number of educators now who seem to think that there are maybe therapists, or maybe that they're trained in counseling, and maybe that they are also social workers. And I know that teachers have to do the best that they think that is possible for the kids in the classroom. But they also need to be mindful, I think, of the extent of their competence. So there's, like, I was taught there are 4 levels of competence, and the first level is when you have no competence and you don't even know you're not competent. It's called unconscious incompetence. And then the next level is when you're consciously incompetent. And, you know, there's some people who are talking about practically doing group therapy with these kids to pull out their emotions, and I am consciously incompetent. I know enough to know I'm not doing that with other people's children who haven't given permission. So I get uncomfortable with the, delving into the emotional aspects, and social emotional learning is a big topic, hot topic right now in K-12, and it seems to be an inroad to get into this pseudo classroom therapy, and I'm opposed to that.
Steve, any thoughts?
Well, I mean, the first is, Braver Angels wouldn't presume to establish the role or the standard here, right? I think where we would be coming in is to emphasize using something that we would call the Braver Angel way. We just kind of talked about that very diverse topics, you know, so you need to get all the stakeholders together. I think the main thing I would bring forth is all the stakeholders in this need to come together, use Braver Angel way or some technique like this. It's a simple technique. And the big thing is then come to a common value, and the voices that are in that conversation must be all of the voices, especially the voices that are disagreeing. And they can do that with very simple ground rules to ensure respect. And that addresses one final thing about brain wiring, right? One of the kind of bad bits of brain wiring is something called confirmation bias. This is a tendency to seek out information that conforms to my preferred beliefs. One of the best ways to get best performance out of teams, and there's research on this, is that you want a diverse set of viewpoints in that team, because then you're addressing confirmation bias, you're questioning assumptions that people have, and this leads to a better solution to a very complicated problem, right? So Braver Angels doesn't have a position on this, but we have a strong recommendation as to the method by which the common value is achieved. That's where we would come in.
You know, one of the things that as we renegotiate, reimagine the social compact that's requisite for good education, that's so important to think about, is a question that Tim Walsh points us to. And this is going back to as we start to wrap up, the very foundational. Tim asks, what is the most important thing that education should do? Let me just pose that to you each. Bonnie?
I mean, the word education means to draw forth. So education, I believe, is to draw forth what is within you, not to stuff something in there that wasn't there before.
Right.
So the goal of education is to begin to draw forth, and I think there's a spiritual element to it myself, which is why I think I'm so hands-off, because I don't know what's in you versus what's in him versus what's in her. That's beyond my scope, and so I have sort of this zone of sanctity around the whole thing, to draw forth what's in you, and you should be guided by your own inner light. That's my answer.
So I think back to when we were planning for how many meals of oatmeal we were going to have to eat when we sent my daughter off to college, because one of our goals was to have her graduate without debt, which was achievable back then. And where we got to is like the choice of school was my daughter's, right? But what we really wanted out of that experience is for our daughter and our son to be exposed in a situation where they would learn how to critically think. I mean, that was the point, right? And I look back to my college. I'll never forget. I was in a college classroom one day where a fundamental belief I had, and it was in a small group setting, fundamental belief, and somebody said, "Do you really believe that?" And And I thought about it, and I said, well, no, I don't. I think we were reading the Bible or something like that, right? But it was like, no, I don't think that's true. And it was, wow, that's what college is all about. I mean, and I don't think that's like Bonnie says, that's not somebody stuffing that into your brain. It is awakening potential that I guarantee is there in all people. And you have to have a view of the high order, the big picture here, so that develops. And I know it comes from encountering things that are different than your typical preferred beliefs, right? And that needs to be done to draw out this kind of thinking capability, because that to me was what was important.
The drawing out potential of education is one of the most beautiful things that can happen in a classroom. We at the Bill of Rights Institute recently have been paying a lot of heed to the Socratic mode of learning, precisely because it allows for that kind of critical thinking, that kind of questioning. Teachers think of it as a kind of inquiry-first model, that you're posing deep questions that allow each individual to grapple with their own beliefs. And in the civics context, as many of you have pointed to, and I'll summarize a couple of questions that have come forward, how do we really teach American exceptionalism? How do we inculcate, Jill Cullis asks, how do we inculcate those virtues? And the answer that I would give, in short, is that we have to be very intentional about that thing. Informed patriotism puts critical thinking at the heart. It doesn't, in response to some of the trends that are out there that would tear down our nation, tell students, you will toe this line, because I think we'll have a similarly bad outcome. But it does put in front of them the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution. It asks them to reflect on stories. It does sound history, sound economics, and it brings that perspective to bear in a way that each child is able to grapple with those fundamental questions. The amazing thing, and I hope you all have an opportunity and would welcome you to, whether through the work that we're doing or others in the civic education arena, to support what is happening when this happens well. Because there's nothing more powerful in pointing us back to the civic mission of schools. Tim, I think in response to your question, it used to be that we put the civic mission at the heart of what it meant to do education. And if you look at the school districts all across the country, their mission statements would be oriented towards citizenship. Those mission statements have long ago been abandoned. And so right now we're not even endeavoring to be one people. We often see, if you see citizenship mentioned at all in mission statements for school districts, it's global citizenship. And what we have to return to is an intentionality that says we want to be one people. That doesn't mean that we're erasing disagreement, because after all, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights itself is a means for managing disagreement with the North Star in mind, the principles of the Declaration. The last question I would pose to each of you is, what is one concrete thing that as we seek to, in our own ways, as parents, as teachers, as those who are involved in the public policy arena, as citizens, as we seek to renegotiate, reimagine this social compact, what's one thing that you would urge people to do? Steve, I'll start with you, and then Bonnie,
Sure.
you can wrap.
So my one thing is have hope that progress can be made. So much is presented to us that it is hopeless, it's insurmountable, and all of that. And I have seen progress made with people of very, very different viewpoints coming to common values that serve this kind of one person, one people attribute. And we want to do that on a grassroots basis, right? There are many people from Braver Angels here in the audience tonight. We would love to take this conversation forward. We're going to have an early lunch. It's close to here. If anybody would like to join us, you can leave your car in the parking lot. But we have people, local resources that will help, places like Denver and Colorado and others that we go. But the main thing is have hope that progress can be made, because progress is being made in certain areas, and we build on that to fuel this new compact of civic education.
My answer is to use your First Amendment rights and don't be afraid to use them because they're only as valuable as you make them. We are self-censoring, our students are self-censoring, and all it takes is one person to stand up and say what they feel, what they truly believe, to encourage other people to do the same. I heard recently from a faculty member who was upset about something going on and he wanted, fire to do something about it, and I said, fire can't do anything about your self-censorship problem. You're a tenured professor with, full professor, go to the faculty senate and speak up, and we'll defend your right to do so, but we can't do it for you. So speak up, use your First Amendment rights. You have everything you need.
Once you start to self-censor, it's incredibly difficult to arrest that trend. I think that's a really sage word. Encourage your young people, too, is the one thing I'd add to that. Despite the fact that they may be in a school where, as John Haidt has said, they're walking on eggshells. We have a lot of those. They're not just district schools. They're charter schools. They're private schools. Encourage your kids, your grandkids, those that you're in touch with, to not self-censor, to engage in a robust conversation. Ask those kids around you questions. You'll be surprised at how insightful they can be. It may take a few times, but that's one of the things that I've really learned from my colleagues at the Bill of Rights Institute, that young people have a lot to say and they have a lot to offer, and that's one of the reasons that we're all here today. I thank you, Bonnie. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah, for the conversation today.
Thank you, David, Bonnie, and Steve. I think Alexis de Tocqueville is one of the more quoted after-dinner speakers, and I'm not going to quote him today, but it's after breakfast, so we're still going to do something with him for just a second, because I think his ghost is in the room a little bit. When he came to the United States as a 20-something Frenchman, he saw something that he said in his work, Democracy in America. He said, the first time I saw this, it didn't even seem serious to me. He said it seemed more silly than serious, but when Americans see a problem, the first thing they do is start talking to each other. They get together, they organize, they work on putting a solution together, and he said before it's done, the problem is solved, the organization might even go away, and no one will have thought to appeal to some sort of great man or political leader. And Alexis de Tocqueville thought that was really weird. He also thought that behavior, that association, the ability to work together to solve problems, was a critical piece of American genius. And that's exactly what we participated in here together, and what I hope will continue as we leave this conversation. I hope you don't just leave it with a few more ideas. I hope you leave it with a couple of new relationships from those that you've sat with or met or talked with today, and that this, as we said from the outset, we can't solve everything here, but there's very little we can't solve if we keep it going. So to all of those who have spoken today, to those who helped with the preparation of the event, please join me in a final round of applause, and we wish you a wonderful day.
Thank you.